Back in 2008, when it first hit our screens, Iron Man wasn't a really majorly loved comic book superhero, unlike say Spider-Man or Wolverine. As most of you already know, Marvel had been bankrupt back in the 90s, as to why they sold most of their very popular characters, some being Spider-Man, Fantastic Four and the X-Men. Well, with the little amount of money they had left, they took a gamble on creating the movie Iron Man, a B-list superhero portrayed by an actor with a troubled past, and not only that, they set their sights on creating an entire connected universe, and boy did that pay off. Join me as I dive into Iron Man, the movie that kickstarted the Marvel Cinematic Universe and redefined superhero cinema. Today I'm planning on starting a continuous series. Seeing as though I'm reviewing mostly Marvel movies, I thought why not start from the very beginning. Get comfy because today we're going to dive into the movie that redefined superhero cinema, Iron Man. The movie is incredibly well structured and well written. I find that the story is great for the initial entry to the cinematic universe, as it introduces things such as the 10 Rings and the Stark weapons industry, all of which is still finding its way into the latest phases with movies like Shang-Chi and Armor Wars if they're still making that. So they clearly knew what they were doing early on in the game. They had foundations set and they went with it. In fact, this movie actually had 4 writers. These were Mark Fergus, Hawk Otsby, Art Markham and Matt Holloway. From researching this movie, I've actually found some stories about the writing process. According to Jeff Bridges, Obadiah Stane, the writing for the film was actually happening as they were filming scenes, so the actors practically had no script for the movie at times. This was because the writers were hired as filming began. Considering that, they did a great job. I mean, I somewhat enjoyed the plot, but to get each character right and to keep those personalities going for 10 years? It's an amazing achievement. The director of Iron Man was no other than Happy Hogan himself, otherwise known as Jon Favreau. A great director and actor. I recently watched a video on how he wrote and starred in one of his first movies, Swingers, and how he barely had any money to even produce it. It then went on to make $4.6 million at the domestic box office, which was a massive accomplishment. Now let's talk about the action pieces in the movie. A lot of it was very practical, especially the flying scenes. They look notably amazing compared to the more recent films like Captain Marvel. When she's flying, you can really tell it's all just CG. I read an article with Jon Favreau where he compared the shots with Top Gun, and he wondered how they managed to film those scenes back when CGI didn't really exist. And I respect them for taking the time to think about it and make it look as realistic as they could. The fighting scenes looked and sounded amazing, especially the repulsors. There was just something about the first time he uses it that hits hard. It's iconic and very intimidating. Mix that with the amazing suit and the soundtrack for the movie, featuring AC/DC and Black Sabbath, it makes for a fascinating watch. The suit was half practical, half CG. This is where I think the peak of superhero costumes was at for me. Now we have mostly CGI suits and they feel off compared to this. Making it practical really harmonised with this movie, especially as he's in the initial stage of building the Iron Man suit, so it's going to be this chunky, heavy piece of equipment. I should really shout out the VFX artists in this movie. They did an amazing job making everything look incredible. Keep in mind this was in 2008, it could have been terrible. The VFX supervisor for Iron Man was John Nelson. He also had the task of finding a way to make Iron Man's heads-up display, or HUD, look the most realistic and easy to shoot. Again, it became something iconic. There was also something fascinating about how they dealt with the technology that Tony Stark uses. The holograms were way ahead of its time and the way he used them just looks unreal. You know the scene where he puts his hand in the holographic repulsor and it's like he's wearing the real thing? That felt revolutionary at the time. This also paved the way for how they portrayed the technology in the MCU. Even in Black Panther, Shuri uses more advanced tech and you can see the similarities. Now, of course I'm going to have to talk about Robert Downey Jr.'s impact on this film. At the time, it was a huge gamble to even cast him, as 5 years prior to this, in 2003, he had only just become sober after years of drug abuse and multiple trips to prison. It's clear to see now that he has turned his life around. Apparently the whole reason Jon Favreau settled on him was because of Robert Downey Jr.'s past, as he felt that it ran parallel with Tony Stark's story in the comics. It's still surprising to me that the studio even went ahead with it. Clearly it was the right decision. Although they did have a few other choices before they finally set on Robert Downey Jr. Actors such as Hugh Jackman, Tom Cruise, Timothy Olyphant, Leonardo DiCaprio, and funnily enough Sam Rockwell, who went on to play Justin Hammer in Iron Man 2. Robert Downey Jr. plays the role excellently and captures his portrayal of Tony Stark incredibly well. Tony here is just as egotistical and self-centered as he is in the comics. This speaks not only to the way Robert Downey Jr. depicts Iron Man, but from the writing as well. Of course, we get an iteration of Pepper Potts in the movie, played by Gwyneth Paltrow. I've never really enjoyed Gwyneth's portrayal of Pepper, she always felt so flat. I do however like the banter between her and Tony. It's amusing to watch them argue and bicker, but in terms of a relationship, I don't think they suit each other. There wasn't really a chemistry between them. Talking about chemistry though, we do get Happy Hogan. Like I said earlier, he's played by Jon Favreau, and he does an amazing job. The friendship between him and Tony is real, and you can feel it here. He's a funny character, and it's mostly just his mannerisms and the way he responds to Tony that makes him entertaining to watch. We get Rhodey in this movie. He's played by Terrence Howard, who's famously the first person to be cast in the MCU, although he gets replaced by Don Cheadle in the future movies. This was because Marvel wanted to dock his pay, but Terrence wanted to get what he was contracted for. Although looking into this, he was paid $4.5 million for his small role in Iron Man, yet Robert Downey Jr. was paid $2 million for his protagonist role in the film. This makes sense as to why Marvel felt the need to dock his pay and increase Robert Downey Jr.'s in the sequel. However, it caused tension between Terrence and Downey, as Downey was getting paid $10 million for the sequel, and Marvel wanted to give $8 million to Terrence. Terrence's performance wasn't bad. I felt like he resembles Rhodey from the comics more than Don Cheadle. He looks more like he's from a military background, and I did like the friendship between him and Tony, but it's quite forgettable other than the connection between Tony and Rhodey in the second movie. In the cave where Tony Stark is captured, we see a man called Ho Jensen, played by Sean Tubb, who captures his role so casually and pulls it off incredibly well. What's strange is that I barely see anyone mentioning Jensen, and yet he's one of the most pivotal players in this movie. He helped Tony create the suit and sacrificed himself to help Tony escape. He was a legend. Due to this, Stark started to learn from what Jensen taught him, and it made him more of the selfless hero we get in future movies. For the villain of the movie, we get Obadiah Stane, also known as the Ironmonger. He's a business rival of Tony. He tries to disguise himself as a friend of Tony's early on. It later turns out that Obadiah was the person who sent the 10 Rings organization after Tony, to then take over the Stark Industries company. He's portrayed by Jeffrey Bridges, who does a very clever job of coming across as an aggressive psychopath. His portrayal is very memorable, especially this scene.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
Like I said earlier, there's a couple of appearances in this that paved the way for upcoming Marvel projects and characters. Agent Coulson gets a brief debut. Having someone who works for S.H.I.E.L.D. play a role in this was actually massive, especially for the future of the MCU. It opened up so many avenues for them, as they could then incorporate S.H.I.E.L.D. into other movies like Thor and Captain America, allowing them to piece this whole tapestry together very early on. There's a brief cameo in the post-credits scene of Samuel L. Jackson's character, Nick Fury, coming to Tony and talking about the Avengers Initiative. Being huge at the time, it went on to be a continuous ritual for a Marvel movie to do. The 10 Rings have an appearance in this too. It's quite clever how they added it, but didn't really utilize it until later on. I know they thought about using the Mandarin in the first movie, but Jon Favreau said that the character was a bit difficult to get right at the time. Now the biggest thing here is how this was the first brushstroke on the canvas that is the MCU. It created so many new and exciting adventures and stories. I think my favourite part is that it's a rush job. They decided to just do this on a whim with characters they had left in their arsenal, and that's why I love this movie. Okay, let's jump into some trivia for the movie. Some of you might already know these, but some of these are quite interesting, such as Robert Downey Jr. improvised the line "I am Iron Man." Paul Bettany, the voice of the Jarvis AI, has said that he hasn't even watched the movie and that this was the easiest role ever. He says it was like a robbery since he only worked for 2 hours and got paid a lot of money. The car Tony was working on in the first act of the film is actually owned by Jon Favreau. The Iron Man 1966 theme song can be heard on occasion. And Stan Lee makes a brief appearance as he plays the role of Hugh Hefner and is said to be his favourite of his many cameos. Okay, I'm going to do a rating segment with this series and rank all the MCU movies I review. So with this one, it has to be up there in the S tier. And I think a lot of people will be with me on that. The movie's success can be attributed to several factors. I mean, Robert Downey Jr.'s charismatic portrayal of Tony Stark, which set the tone for the entire MCU. Jon Favreau's skilled direction as he balances action, humour and the character development. It has impressive visual effects that still hold up today, particularly the practical effects used for the Iron Man suit. It had a well-structured story that laid the groundwork for future MCU installments, and the strong supporting performances that brought the depth to the world of Tony Stark. Despite the challenges in the writing process, the movie managed to deliver a coherent and engaging narrative. Iron Man not only revitalized Marvel as a brand, but also redefined what audiences could expect from superhero movies. It set a new standard for character development, visual effects, and interconnected storytelling in the genre, proving that with the right combination of talent, vision, and a bit of risk-taking, even a B-list superhero can become a cultural icon.